This is now my first full season with the organization, and this was a project that was in motion even before I joined on. Steve Schick, our previous artistic director, had helped to set it in motion, and so you hear from Steve Schick, and he says, Myra, we want you to write a piece for contemporary players. You know, what are your first thoughts, and where did it start to come out of the clouds for you, and you say, all right, I'm starting to get some sense of what I want that to actually be?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things he said to me right at the beginning was, we want you to write this piece, and we want you to get everyone improvising. So my first sort of questions were, well, how do I do that? And that I would play with the players. So what kind of situation would I like to create for myself to improvise in? And then finding interesting ways to amplify and use the very discrete, sometimes tiny sounds I would make on the inside of the piano. And really think about how to bring those into a concert situation. Some of them are very fragile and difficult to make and very quiet. And so it's always been a conundrum, how do I perform these things live? And then the idea to record them and translate them, if you will, or orchestrate them for an acoustic ensemble started to take shape.
So let's talk a little bit about that and just the evolution of you and your work with the players that has, basically gone over the whole course of the last season leading up to this week and tonight.
And I started meeting with each of the players individually, partly to get a sense of what their comfort level and experience has been with improvisation, what kinds of things I could ask them to do, what kinds of things maybe wouldn't be such a great idea, and also to begin to develop the material for the piece by asking them to imitate or respond to the recordings I had made of this inside the piano material. And with the idea that I was then creating a lexicon or a set of vocabulary, gestures and sounds and techniques that they would then use when they perform the piece, especially when they have a lot of decisions to make in terms of when they play them and how they play them and how they develop them. So I did that for a few months where I met with everybody. I did a workshop with some of the players. Some of the players do have quite a bit of improvisational experience, and I figured I could then call on them to maybe do a bit more improvising along with me. So I workshopped ideas with them, and then, transcribed what they played and started to think about how might I orchestrate it. I can't have everybody playing everything all the time. So choosing which instruments sounded really great on certain textures and in combination with each other, and it started to build from there. Huge thanks to several of my students and former students for, because as many of you know, I come out of the jazz tradition and have not done this kind of notation before. So they really helped me say, okay, this is how, this might be a good way to do it. And then I met with the players again and said, what if you were reading this, what does it sound like? And if I wanted it to sound a little bit more like the recording, I'd play that for them again, and we'd figure out, well, they'd say, why don't you write it like this? It was a really back and forth process.
Yeah, it's extremely collaborative,
yeah.
Right, from the start. And so then the larger kind of form and the whole way the piece is going to feel and shape kind of starts to take hold in your mind, right? So how did that end up forming, you know?
Well, I think there were certain things that I heard right from the beginning. I knew that I wanted to involve these recordings somehow through a kind of music, a piece of music concrete, and that it would be maybe interesting to kind of do it as an installation so that it would be playing in the hall, you know, before, so people would start to get an idea of what this sound world is. And I knew there was one particular sound that I wanted to end the piece with. And I knew certain things. I knew that I, as a player coming out of jazz, I wanted to have some section where I could really play with and on top of the band in a way that where they were almost a rhythm section for me. And I knew I wanted to feature, you know, different players and different units. Like I wanted everybody to have some sort of moment, and I think that comes out of the jazz tradition as well. I did a residency at the Atlantic Center for the Arts for a week, and I had all this material, and I just started plotting it out on a timeline and imagining the transitions and how things would develop. And one of the things that I did with the help of one of my grad students is analyze a couple of the sounds from the inside of the piano, and then sculpted them, took out some of the frequencies, could see what the frequencies in the sound were. This was a bowed sound where I would take, you know, like bow hair and put it inside the low strings and then bow the strings. And I put this into this program and sculpted it, took out some of the frequencies, and then we put that into a program that was developed at Earcom, that actually, in open music, that actually spit out the notation on a piano staff, just a treble clef. So cool. And I had all these, I did that with several of the sounds, not just the one I mentioned first. And so I had all this kind of crazy notated material, and I started looking at the shapes of it and finding phrases I like, and just basically cut that up and put it back together again, which is how I came up with the piano material, and eventually the material that the other players joined me on later.
That is so cool. I did not even know that detail. We didn't get a chance to talk about it over the course of the week, which is amazing. Yeah. So the notes that we hear are, in a sense, coming from that like sound map. Exactly. Of bow hair.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. I have a debt of gratitude to some of the amazing, innovative jazz pianists of the 60s and 70s who were really important mentors for me. People like Cecil Taylor and Andrew Hill and Don Pullen and Muhal Richard Abrams and Andrew Hill. And I feel like there is a fine line there between, especially with Cecil, for instance, between contemporary classical music or new music and jazz improvisation. He really straddled that line. Improvisation. He really straddled that line. And so I'm thinking about the emotion and the passion and the energy and the rhythmic drive of someone like that within this, within a context that's all about sound and timbre and the texture and, you know, so I would say less of a story, but more wanting, and exploring sound is something I've been doing for a long time, and I do it in a lot of more open improvisation situations. So it was really wanting to bring those things together in what is in quite a new language for me as a composer.
Yeah. What are some of the adjectives you found yourself using in trying to describe the different qualities of these sounds to our musicians? Like take something like Little Creatures, for example, which is a section of the piece in a technique.
Yeah, I think Well, I mean, it's funny. The woman who had been recording them for me decided that we should call that Little Creatures. So it was just sort of an easy thing to keep calling it. But I think, there's a certain quality to the sound that's quite metallic. It's something that I make by rocking a hot rod or hot rail humbucker on the strings, which is like a humbucker, as many of you probably know, is used to amplify electric guitar strings and sounds. And I use this on the piano, but it's the kind that's used for a pedal steel. So it doesn't have nodes that line up with the guitar strings, and I can get 4 or 5 notes. And then I put that sound through a mixer, and I can tweak the EQ on it to get that sound. And so I really, rather than describing it too much, I wanted the players to just imitate it, even if it was impossible, which it is. Because that's how you get at interesting things, right? By trying what's impossible. But then when they took it, it starts quite quickly. You might even hear a little bit of it soon. It's these very quick, tiny little sounds. And then one time when there's a quartet that will play this evening as part of the piece, they started stretching it out and getting quite lyrical, but not losing the quality of the sound. And it was this very dreamy kind of section that I loved. So that's one of the adjectives I've been using during rehearsal is don't forget that's someplace you can take this. That this material is a point of departure rather than something that you're reading verbatim off the page.
Yeah, well, I would love to actually get into some of the sound world of this piece. And we can do that both with some of the cues that you actually have pre-recorded, right. And we can also do it by inviting 2 of our musicians to stage. So maybe we start with Little Creatures?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. And then that's shortly followed upon after a few different episodes by this different texture, brush sticks.
Could you make it a little louder, Amadeus?
So the piece unfolds in a kind of continuous exploration of these kinds of sounds and textures, right? And they feed around the ensemble, and everybody kind of has a different moment and a different chance to kind of explore these things. But like any other great, classical composition or improvised structure, there is also a through line, and there's also a tune, right? There's a sort of a big tune that functions into it.
Right. And we hear that early on the piano, and then we hear it later with clarinet and flute, and then we hear it finally for the full ensemble towards the end.
Yeah, in a kind of bust-out fashion.
Right.
And I just to get it in our ears, I was going to ask Kyle to play just a snippet of it, because it comes back in many different ways, like you say, and different guises.
Yeah.
But this is a sort of a single phrase worth of it. I feel the whole rehearsal process this week has been so fascinating because it's this sort of continuous exploration of all of these different elements in rehearsal and kind of seeing all right, so how far can we push that certain thing before it becomes something that it's not, or how far can we take it, to its absolute furthest threshold and still retain, the thing itself and also keep it interesting from moment to moment.
Yep.
Right, and it's something that we were even talking about, right up until the dress rehearsal this afternoon, right?
Exactly.
It's like we're experiencing certain sections and then saying, amongst all of ourselves, okay, let's find a way to make sure that at every moment we're each keeping it all interesting for ourselves. Which is in improvisation.
Exactly.
Key, right?
Exactly. It's key to improvisation. Because as you pointed out, when the improviser is curious and engaged, it creates an energy that allows the audience to hopefully become engaged as well. I really want the input and the creativity and the ideas of the individual players to come into it. At the same time, I want to maintain a certain control maybe over the big picture and the kinds of materials. But I like that, and I also am really interested in this idea that, this idea of having some ambiguity in a piece or in the title of a piece, or so that it can mean different things to different people, but we can all experience it together. I usually keep a title bank at home, and because I like often discovering later what words might be evocative or might pose some kind of koan, like how does this relate to the music? And I like that there's room for, I hope, the listener to come up with some ideas about the story. But in this case, I was really struggling to come up with a title. And then I was looking, I like to look through, books of contemporary artwork. And I saw this great image of a piece by Joseph Beuys, the German artist who, some of you may have seen it, it's a piano that's covered in gray felt, and it's got a red cross on the side of it. It was something that was inspired by his time as an ambulance driver during World War II. And he called it homogeneous infiltration for piano, which is already intriguing to me because it's not actually a piece of music for the piano. But I realized that it fit very well for my idea about this piece, which is that everything you hear tonight is coming out of the piano. The original source of all the material, there's this homogeneity to the source of the sounds. And a sense that we're infiltrating or we're permeating the inside of the piano and then bringing it back out to you through many different means.
So we've had this evolution of the piece that has been more than a year, and working with the players and now this last week of concentrated rehearsals and all the exploration that has gone on in that, right? Do you eventually see this then as a piece that we could take the score in parts, hand it off to a different ensemble, and expect the same result?
No. But we might get another interesting result or a good result, which is what I'm hoping. But as we've learned through this, first of all, I would have to say that the piece really was a person-specific piece. I was writing for these players and had to adjust when some of the players had to leave and other people came in. And then it was a question of finding out how the new people would play some of this material and not ask them to just imitate what somebody else had done. So I'm hoping that I might be able to do something like this with another group of players, but then have to go through some of that same process for them to make it their own.